morning, Helen,
Good
and
morning.
welcome to the podcast. I'm absolutely delighted and really excited to have you here today, not least because you have a formidable career backstory, and I'd love to just explore what you have achieved, but also the learnings that we can take, given we're facing into a very complex, challenging environment and where we're trying to meet the needs of people, planet and profit. Before I start, I just wanted for our audience just share some of your remarkable achievements. So you were the first woman to be elected as Prime Minister in New Zealand, and you held that role for almost a decade. You were also the first and only woman to lead the United Nations Development Programme. You were appointed by Dr. Ted Ross from the World Health Organization to co-chair the independent panel for the pandemic preparedness and response, which was actually mandated by the World Health Assembly. A really incredible honor to be doing that role. And you are chair of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, really shining a spotlight on how much you care about climate, and we will pick that up. And last but not least, the chair of the Global Leadership Foundation, which is a phenomenal group of individuals that do some great things for countries and government and democracy. So we will explore all of those things, if that's okay, this morning. But you have been a real advocate of growth, but economic growth that it is achieved through advancement in equality. And there are different lenses, whether it's health, education, and we'll explore those. So I'd like to start by asking you, Helen, what does sustainable growth mean to you?
Well, it means to me having the growth that can deliver the human development results that we all want, with people highly educated, healthy, properly housed, social safety nets, but achieving that growth in a way that doesn't do further damage to the planet. The truth is that over the way the world has developed in a long time, we've started to exceed planetary boundaries, which is quite serious for the balance between humanity and nature. And we can't go on like that. And I think there's a general recognition of that. But of course, the transition away from the way we've traditionally done things to new ways is not an easy transition. And it needs a lot of investment. It needs people to change the way they do things, both in their personal lives, company level, government level. Change is never easy, and it requires leadership, and it requires quite a lot of courage.
Wow, we're going to unpack all of that shortly. But one thing you do talk about is inclusive human development, sustainable development, and resilient development, which is a really lovely way of articulating how you sort of put those ingredients together. But do you think growth that balances the needs of people, planet and profit is really achievable given the complexities that we have to face into?
We're not short of knowledge on how to do things. We have incredible innovation, science, technology. We're approaching these challenges with more capacity than we've ever had before. So we have to believe it's possible, because we know that the converse, if we carry on how we are, is a road to disaster. What's happening to our climate is horrifying. The growing inequalities in our societies are causing huge pressures. And this lack of resilient development is really starting to pinch us now. I used to say when I was at the United Nations Development Programme, if development isn't risk-informed, it can't be sustainable development. And look now at how we see the development gains made just washed away with floods, with landslides, with all kinds of extreme weather events. So we have to build resilience to the situation we've already got ourselves into, but also think of the other kinds of shocks which have knocked our economy sideways. I mean, the pandemic has been something like a $25 trillion shock to the global economy over the period of 3, 4, 5 years, and with more than 20 million dead. That is very significant. And we weren't resilient to it. We weren't prepared. So we need to build resilience to shocks of all kind. And any company, any government that isn't doing over the horizon forecasting isn't going to be doing their voters, their clients, their consumers a favour.
So the work that you did that led actually on the independent panel, there was quite a lot of learnings and conclusions that came out of that were for government. I wondered if you would be happy to share, but more importantly, what I'd love to do is understand how businesses can learn from some of those learnings that came out of that review.
Our review was pretty critical of the international response, and justifiably so. We were asked to do it from the May 2020 World Health Assembly and to report by the following May. I think the World Health Assembly assumed that it would be done and dusted and we'd be back to life as normal. And as we know, that wasn't true. The vaccines only came along at the end of 2020. The response to vaccination was woefully inequitable. And to this day, there are any number of low-income countries around our world who have very, very low rates of vaccination for their people. So we identified all sorts of mistakes. Firstly, China was opaque. That's the reality. It didn't give the information it should have given in a timely fashion, nor was WHO empowered to get that information, to inspect on the site, to warn the world properly. It took a month to get a pandemic emergency declared. And then no one took any notice anyway. Governments just sort of carried on thinking, well, that's something that's happening in China. And then it happened in Iran. And then suddenly it hit Italy and it was full force in Europe and the US. And then people started to sit up and take notice. But then you had the distrust of science, the distrust of authorities, the conspiracy theories. It all went downhill. Messages for business, in reality, how many businesses were factoring a pandemic risk into how they were operating? I've been going to the World Economic Forum at Davos for years and years and years, and actually pandemic risk was always there, but well below the risk of what was happening with the climate and inequity and so on. So I think it's been a wake-up call for everyone, and I think for companies, being prepared for any kind of adverse event, think the unthinkable. Who would have thought that we would have a pandemic on the scale of the 1918 flu pandemic and not be able to handle it any better?
Yeah. Hopefully we have learnt and we will handle something like that again in the future.
Yeah, we're not confident about that people have learned, because we look at the slow progress on the reforms that are needed. And I compare it with Chernobyl. After Chernobyl, within 5 months, during the Cold War, UN member states negotiated 2 new nuclear safety conventions. Here we are, more than 3 years after the onset of the pandemic, and the Geneva negotiations on a new pandemic treaty are pretty bogged down and likely not to be a very good outcome. So we really haven't learned. The geopolitics is tougher in a way than during the Cold War when it was more structured.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But one of the things I think businesses have taken away from the pandemic is the social impact. And as you quite rightly highlighted, the inequalities and even in the current environment, with even in the UK, low growth, high interest rates, persistent inflation, cost of living really biting society. I think all businesses, not just in the UK, globally, are trying to balance the impact or the social impact. Right, climate is absolutely an emergency and a big priority, but there is a growing focus on social impact, which I think is probably exacerbated by the pandemic, and equitable, and an equitable economy, which is quite a challenge at the country level, let alone if you're a business that has certain influences and able to affect change in certain areas, but not all areas. One of the things that you've said is that you had a vision for New Zealand. And you would like to think that you put the building blocks in place for defining the values, developing the culture and arts, and supporting families which reap the dividends for generations, which I think beautifully encapsulates this absolute ambition to balance the needs of everyone. And in that time, you brought in multiple economic reforms and led the way in terms of environment safeguards and emissions trading that have been copied globally. So in many ways, ahead of your time. What was the biggest learning for you in coming to that sort of, leadership role and also in leading a nation?
Well, we all come to these roles against a certain background. If I think of I came from a farming family in an area about 2 hours south of Auckland. And by the time I was born, during the Korean War wool boom, farming was relatively prosperous, but people had come from pretty tough times. My mother's father had been a World War I veteran, gassed on the Somme. When people came home from the war, they were often offered what was called a rehab farm, rehabilitation. Mum's father had to walk off 2 completely unviable farms and ended up with jobs in a city. And then the Great Depression came. He was sent to a work camp. My mother and her brother was sent to stay with grandparents. These are sort of searing experiences for life. Dad's family were on the farm, so were able to be more self-sufficient, I suppose. And even in the middle of the Great Depression, somehow they got the money together to send the children all the way to a boarding school from the farm. So I came out of a background where education was seen as just the most critical path out of adversity and towards opportunity. And also very conscious of the social safety nets for the old and the sick and the poor and the disabled. So when I came into politics, I had these things very much on my mind, that people should be able to enjoy the kind of opportunity that I had had and the backstop we had with a comprehensive national health service like the UK. So that was always a big reason for being in politics. But then I was also in a generation where the environmental issues started to loom larger. 1972 was the Stockholm Conference on the Environment and Development. 1992, the Rio Earth Summit. And out of that summit came the 3 big environmental conventions on climate change, combating desertification, and the Biodiversity Convention. And really the last 3 decades or more have seen growing momentum to address these important issues. So you can't be in politics today only talking about socioeconomic development and not looking at the balance with nature, because it's been so disrupted. So that was the package, if you like, that I went into politics to do something about.
And what a legacy you left. You've also said that no one is going to put out a red carpet for any of us. And you have to knock those doors down, which is something that resonated really closely with some of the things that I've seen. It demonstrates that we all face into challenges, and to really be brave to push a better outcome for everybody requires that mindset. You've got to knock it down. I'd love to understand, or maybe you could share some of the experiences that you had that really pushed those boundaries, whether it's in your role as the Prime Minister or even in your United Nations development program.
I think in your career you need a little bit of luck. And one piece of luck I had was being born into a farming family with no brothers, because my observation was that where there were boys in the family, the boys, of course, would inherit the farm. They would go on to have those sorts of careers, and the girls would be lucky to get the insurance policy paid up on the 21st birthday. The girls would do jobs more with mum in the house. The boys would do it on the farm. Now, Dad had no boys, so the girls did everything. And I came into life thinking girls could do anything. And of course, my parents were terribly supportive of us and our education. I went to an all-girls school. When I went to university at the age of 18 in the late 60s, it was very obvious there weren't many women on the staff, even though the student body coming through as the post-war baby boomers were roughly equal in male and female. So that sort of started to sensitise me to the fact that not everybody expected that girls could do everything. And then, but university was kind of a meritocracy, so you sailed along. And I only started to run up against the issues of gender myself when I put my hand up for political positions that were highly contested. When I sought the selection to be a member of parliament for a safe constituency for my party, there was me and there were 6 men, right? And I won, despite everyone saying it was a working man's electorate and they wouldn't want a woman MP. I mean, half the electorate was female votes, so I never quite worked out where the working man thing came from. But, these obstacles kept sort of rearing their heads. And then you can also go a certain distance, again, on, being hardworking and competent. But when I put my hand up to be leader of the opposition, then all hell let loose with gender-based criticism, because at that time, people were unduly obsessed with how you looked, what you wore, things that were really quite extraneous, but you had to try and neutralise somehow, and that took a while as well. I think a lot of women who've been the first into things would identify with that. And then once you get to the top perch, basically you've seen everybody off, so you can have quite a good run. But as you start to, come off the peak of public tolerance of you, the gender-based criticisms come back again, nanny state, always telling you people what to do. So this misogyny is deep in every society. It never quite goes away. But you have to have a deaf ear to it, because otherwise it'll depress you and trip you up.
Thank you for that insight, Helen, really, and your honesty around that. You've talked a lot about sort of government and role of politicians. I just wanted to look at the intersections. We're all, even as businesses, we're looking at the impact we have on society. We're looking at the impact we have on the climate, directly and indirectly. We're promoting inclusion, which actually aligns with what you were trying to do for a nation. And so I just wanted to sort of get your perspectives on some of the power. It's a very different scale and probably a slightly lesser complexity. But I'd love to get some of your learnings that we could share with some business leaders.
Well, I think business has, the capacity to do a power of good, and a great deal of business does a huge amount of good. Obviously, there's a lot of pressure on particularly the global businesses now to be themselves looking at carbon zero targets and how they're going to get there. And you see businesses approaching this with tremendous goodwill, how they're taking emissions out of their whole value chain. But the social inclusion side is also a very important part of the recipe. And coming back to a point you raised earlier about the pandemic and the inequities it exposed, among those inequities were health inequities and the burden of non-communicable diseases. And I wonder whether companies could build more systematically into the way they interact with their workforce, support for being healthy. The reality is that at lower economic status levels, at marginalised groups, minority groups in the society, you have a higher burden of non-communicable disease, heart disease, the tobacco-related illnesses, respiratory generally, diabetes, renal failure. We can, in the way we organise the workplace, the working week, we can help address those issues and help people have the tools available to address them. And that has to be at every level of the business. It has to be the cleaner and the cafeteria attendant through to senior manager. The burden of non-communicable diseases is the biggest killer these days. And if we don't get on top of it, then we will start to see life expectancy roll back again.
That is a really interesting angle that you've raised there, because one of the things that most of my peers talk about when we talk about the world post-pandemic is, what does this world of hybrid working mean? Because everybody's trying to sort of get a good balance, because there were good things that came out of the pandemic in terms of balance, but there are also very negative things. And you've talked about some of the non-communicable diseases, which are mainly physical, but we're also seeing mental well-being and also emotional well-being, which I think is probably a combination of the other two. But as businesses, we're all grappling with that. And you're also in the mix of that, grappling with generational shifts, as you will have seen, and you're probably experiencing now in your women's leadership role that you play. You're a real big proponent of equality. That is such a really important thing. In terms of generational, is there anything that you have seen that, apart from health we talked about, is there anything else that you think might be worth businesses thinking about?
Well, Generation X is different, right?
Yeah, very different to Generation
Millennials
Z.
are different. I mean, I come from an age group where when you presented for a job, the attitude was, here's what I could do for you. And people say that flip right around to basically the prospective employee interviewing the company and saying, what are you going to do for me? Which we would never have thought of raising. But hey, it's great that young people are confident and have that sense of self-belief, but there's also vulnerability, and we saw that during the pandemic. We saw the mental health issues, particularly among young people. Young people are very social. Even though they're on social media and the phones a lot, they're also social, and that opportunity was taken away. So it took quite a heavy toll. And I think for businesses now, getting that balance of the working remotely and the working in the office is quite challenging. A lot of workplaces have found that people don't want to go back to work, but then if they're isolated at home, that's not necessarily healthy either. I mean, one thing about getting up and coming to work every day is it does require some physical activity, right? And which is not a bad thing. And then the workplace is also a social place. I mean, think about how we define ourselves. If I say to you, what do? You will define it by your work role. One of the most sobering things I ever experienced was saying to someone at a meeting 40, 50 years ago, what do you do? And he said, I'm in the army. I said, really? He said, the army of the unemployed. He couldn't define himself by his work. And we do identify ourselves by work roles. So, it becomes extremely important for people to be in work, to be included, to be able to be a social being. I think one of the things you see around now is a lot of the work hubs out in the suburbs. Young people don't necessarily sit in the apartment. They're going to go to a work hub where there's good Wi-Fi and you can connect with others. But all of this is critical to social well-being.
It is, absolutely. How would you define yourself?
Myself? Well, I like to think I'm a kind person. I don't. I take people as I find them. I try to do the best I can with the voice that I have to make the world a better place. I think we've all privileged to have a certain time on this earth. We can waste it or we can do something purposeful. So purpose is important to me, and being able to achieve something that's worthwhile for others.
I just want to pick up on purpose. You have always been very vocal about politicians with purpose, which in itself, it can have different connotations. You've just explained what defines you. That is your purpose, isn't it? Or is there something else we've not picked up as well?
No, that's pretty much my purpose. But it's interesting that the term conviction politician has quite negative connotations now, because it can mean people who are very ideological and really not open to fresh ideas or reason or evidence. And I like to think that, I look for evidence of what works. Without being heavily ideological about it. I mean, clearly I've come from the centre-left of politics, but it's looking at the evidence, having a vision of a society that's more equitable, inclusive and sustainable. But what's going to get us there? What is going to get us there? That's what you focus on. What are the steps that need to be taken?
So picking up on that, I talk about the power of the collective, because we can all do our own little things, but actually doing it together, doing it in alignment is much more powerful, which is exactly highlighted in your example around the independent panels work, right? So in terms of collaboration between government and business, is there anything there that you've seen or any views you have in terms of how we can work together for better to deliver that positive impact?
Well, firstly, I think the relationship has to be very professional, because we're all aware of where individual politicians or governments get too close in a way that isn't proper and doesn't lead to due diligence around contracts and so on. So I was always very conscious in government that it had to be a professional relationship, that your life is an open book. And I think for business that's important as well. Ethical business wants to be seen to be doing things properly. So then you need to create ways where business can engage in a meaningful way. I think it's good to try to design inclusive dialogue platforms, which is one of the things which attracted me to chairing the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which was a UK initiative, by the way, going back over 20 years. But that has, sitting on the board, 3 constituencies. It has governments, it has industry, and it has civil society. And together they have to try and move to a meeting of minds, which isn't always easy, but at least everybody hears each other, and you try to keep an atmosphere of reasonable respect so everyone can make their point.
I think that that trio of business, government and civil society is increasingly the trio that even business has to work in. When we're thinking about what we stand for, what we try to aspire to achieve, it has to take into account all of our stakeholders. And actually civil society has got a growing voice, I would say, now, more so than it used to. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of other roles you have. One of the things I didn't mention earlier is that in 2019 launched the Helen Clark Foundation. And it's what I love about your purpose and your ethos is that you are embedded in research and evidence. And I just wondered if you would share for our audience some of the things that you are progressing through that foundation.
We've had a great relationship with WSP, who are very focused on urban design and sustainability and infrastructure design of cities and so on. So that's led to some good work around congestion charging, for example, which we don't have in New Zealand, but London's had for a couple of decades from recollection. Designing for safety, so a good body of work there. But we also look to, open up for public debate issues that are a lot tougher. And one that we did last year with the New Zealand Drug Foundation was on the importance of massive harm reduction and policy change around methamphetamine use, which is a problem in New Zealand. It's not a sort of double-digit figure habit, but it has got an impact in poorer marginalised communities, particularly Indigenous communities. And we take the view, and I also have a hat as chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, that drug use and possession should not be criminalised. We have to deal with these as health and social issues, and we have to invest in massive harm reduction. And we do have some useful initiatives on that in New Zealand, but we could do a lot more. So we opened up debate on that. We recently did a webinar with University of Oslo and the Arctic University of Norway on this, because they face similar issues in remote rural communities and including among Indigenous people. And it was interesting to get that cross-cultural exchange on it.
I want to move on a little bit because there's so much I want to cover with you, Helen. You have never shied away from taking leadership roles, but one of the positions that you hold is as chair of the Global Leadership Foundation. Not many people will know about it because you purposefully are a sort of silent movement that is for the good of the global economy. Would you like to share some of the things you do?
So the Global Leadership Foundation was established by F.W. de Klerk, the former president of South Africa and co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize with Nelson Mandela, because the two of them changed South Africa for the better. Democratic constitution, rule of law, both great men from very, very different backgrounds. And who would have thought that the system that FW came out of could have produced a change agent like him? The insight that he had was, of course, that he wasn't the only person who faced incredible problems as a leader, and that it would have been helpful to him, and he assumed helpful to others facing similar great challenges, although almost nothing is as great as having to dismantle apartheid was, but that peer support could be useful. And he founded the Global Leadership Foundation with a view to being able to offer discreet advice and peer support to other leaders facing these challenges. And that's the history of the organisation. And FW led it until just before his tragic death in the past couple of years. But he recruited a fascinating group of people from other heads of state and government, like me, relatively more recent entrant, but people who've been very senior in the international system, senior ministers, people with a range of diplomatic and governmental skills, and to this day we actively identify where there might be opportunities to make an offer for discreet support, and we busy ourselves with that. We've tended to be below the radar, although these days we do a little more of the op-ed public-facing work, but not in a way that jeopardises the confidential nature of relationships with leaders, because no leader really wants it to be known that they're seeking support, because that looks like weakness. So you go in below the radar. But we can say that, for example, with the process that ended the Mozambique civil war, which had gone for decades, the Global Leadership Foundation played quite a significant role over quite a period of time to stop the fighting between Frelimo and Renamo, which was so damaging to the country.
I've followed you and watched you because I did have the pleasure of meeting your predecessor, President F.W. de Klerk, about 10 years ago. And the work that you do is so important, but it is under the radar, as you said. But one of the things I've always wanted to ask you is, over your time of being involved, how have you seen the qualities of leadership evolve or change?
Well, I've seen women as very effective leaders during crises like the pandemic. I think that's where women's leadership was on full display. The ability to empathise, the ability to listen to the range of advice, make a judgment and communicate accordingly, much less narcissism. Now, on average, we can say women did well during the pandemic. Some men did well as well, but not all. Where there was not that empathy, where there was not the honest communication about what was known and what wasn't, then people didn't step up to leadership roles. Look, I follow each year what's happening with Mo Ibrahim's African Leadership Prize. Isn't it a tragedy that in quite a number of years he can't award the prize because he can't see a leader who's stepped up? And, we still see to this day leaders who won't accept that their time is up, that their constitution says you have 2 terms and no more, and then they change it, and they change it again. And this is not good for their people. It doesn't let new generations come through. Look, you may not approve of who comes after you in government, but you've got to pass the baton on and move back. And we don't see enough of that. So I think leadership at its best is a wonderful thing, but we often don't see it at its best. And this applies across countries at all levels of income and across regions and continents. You can get very bad leaders, you can get very good leaders, but we need more good leaders.
And I think there are some parallels into the business world. The businesses are evolving. We've got a technology revolution. We've got the emergence of generative AI. We have this generational challenge. Our median age is 27, so there are more Gen Zs than there are Gen Xs in our organisation. So we're all facing into this new world. And the emergence of good leaders is absolutely critical for the success or sustainable growth of our businesses and the economy. But I just want to pick up on the thing that you talked to, because you said women leadership in crisis has really stood out to you. There will be, as a female leader who has played very senior roles across the spectrum on big issues, what advice would you give to women who aspire to these leadership roles? We did talk a little bit about knocking down those doors and the resilience. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I think women are often put off by leadership roles. They think that it's too nasty, and the social media age and the trolling has enabled misogyny, which has always been there, to take new forms and assume new levels. Very, very unpleasant. I saw how Jacinda Ardern was trolled and really hounded out of office by that ability of malign people to form these communities online and then mobilise accordingly. And it moves from online then to physical manifestation. Like everywhere she went, she was dogged by unpleasant crowds shouting about vaccine mandates and other things. But what I would say to women is you have to be prepared to step up into leadership roles, because if you're not there, where are the women's perspectives? You can't just say it's too rough, too nasty, I'm not going to be there. You have to go in with the view that you can make change for the better. And I think the same in the corporate and organisational leadership role. Yes, it's hard, but if you're not there, how are you going to change it? How are you going to make for more family-friendly workplaces, kinder workplaces, more inclusive workplaces? You have to believe you can make a difference, and don't shy away from stepping up. And by the way, I mean, it's not a lifelong commitment, right? Our time at the top is a relatively short and privileged time. I had 9 years at the top as a leader of government, which is quite a long run. I had 8 years as the leader of a major UN agency. That was 2 terms, that's enough. These are not life sentences. You go on, and life continues to open many doors, and you have the choice to walk through them or shut them. My advice is walk through them. Never look opportunity in the eye.
And clearly in your career, this is exactly what you've done. You've continued with your personal purpose in any role that you've taken on. But while women can aspire to be in these roles, how did you deal with the inevitable criticisms and challenges that you would have faced, as you've just explained? Jacinda would have faced into too. Is there any tips there? And I suspect this is relevant for any leader. How do you keep yourself resilient to this external challenge constantly?
Well, firstly, I think you have to depersonalise it, because while the attacks are coming on you, it's not just on you. It's on the government you lead. It's trying to get at what you stand for by you personally, but don't let that get to you. You have to build very strong networks. Your family's always important. Your close friends are important. A lot of people in the fast lane burn off family and friends because they're very preoccupied with a career. This is not a good idea. You need good networks of colleagues, so who you appoint around you is very important. And you have to keep an open ear to where you might be going off course, where you need to correct, but don't allow yourself to be dragged down by the negativity. I also came from a generation that had to fight very hard to get to the top, so we never walked away. Never walked away from a fight. You'd go in and confront it head on. I think younger people perhaps aren't so inclined to do that. They might think, well, okay, I've had enough, I'm going. But we never sort of gave up a foothold without, being really voted out or beaten out of it, as it were. So different attitude there.
Different attitude, but it comes back to one of the first things we talked about, that resilient development, and it applies to individuals as much as systems. I'd like to turn to a little bit about you, because I think we started to sort of learn and take away some really great tips. Many people look to you for guidance and counsel, drawing on your experience and perspective. Who do you turn to seek counsel, guidance, advice? Over
the years, close networks of friends. When I was a young person, university lecturer, senior student university lecturer, and going into politics, I had two people who were very influential who supported me, my former professor of political studies and his associate professor, male and female, tremendously supportive of young people making those steps into political careers. And then there'd usually be older politicians who'd been around a bit who you would take notice of. I think today, for women making their way up, those circles have expanded because while there's never been a huge number of women leaders, there are others who are touchstones. I mean, I would look, for example, to the career of Mary Robinson, who did a phenomenal job and still a good friend. I'd look to Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was Norway's first woman prime minister, wonderful woman, went on to head the WHO. So these women became kind of touchstones to see how they handled their job. There's many more of them today. When Jacinda was Prime Minister of New Zealand, you had the young Finnish Prime Minister, the young Icelandic Prime Minister, the young Danish woman Prime Minister. Angela Merkel was there for a very, very long time. Erna Solberg in Norway, Mia Mottley in Barbados. I mean, just an incredible cadre of women.
Helen, you've just returned from Nepal to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Edmund Hillary and Tenzing's ascent of Everest. I know you like trekking, but that would have been a very important moment for you. But you also wrote in the Times recently about how the visible impact of climate change was there. You could see it. Would you like to just share maybe a little bit about the actual event, because it's a very big moment in history, but equally, your thoughts on what you saw?
The first ascent of Everest on the 29th of May 1953 was a phenomenal event for New Zealand and Nepal. These two men no one had ever heard of catapulted to the top of global consciousness, really, because Everest had been thought to be not conquerable. Could human beings survive at that kind of well over 8,000 metre altitude? And I grew up with the legend of Sir Edmund Hillary, same generation as my father. My dad had all his books, but a national hero. And same for Tenzing in Nepal. So I was asked a number of years ago to become the patron of the New Zealand Himalayan Trust, and I've been in that capacity to the Everest region of Nepal twice, because to this day we raise money along with associated trusts in the UK, Canada and the US and Australia for the hospitals, schools, water infrastructure, bridges, reforestation in that mountain region. So it's phenomenal to go there and sort of tread in the footsteps of the great man who didn't walk away with Everest with a notch in his belt and say, I've done that, go and do other things. He said to the Sherpa community, how can I support you as you've supported me? And they said to him, our children have eyes but cannot see. We want schools. Amazing. And when the first hospital and clinics that Ed built went in there, the two big problems were TB and goiter and severe iodine deficiency, which can lead to severe mental disability, which was present in so many families. Now it's non-communicable diseases, but moved to a different generation of disease. But it's been phenomenal. But what you know when you're in the Himalayas is that the warming climate is taking a terrible toll on what is called the world's third pole, which is the Hindu Kush Himalaya range of mountains running from Afghanistan through to the east of Nepal and to India. And downstream of that mass of glaciers, snow and ice live 2 billion people. We are told that on current forecasts of global warming, 2/3 of those glaciers will be gone in 70 years. The Pakistan floods, which were so devastating in recent times, were exacerbated by glacial melt. As our glaciers melt, they're not storing the water that needs to be slowly released, particularly through the summers. So we face more drought, more food insecurity, more downstream flooding and disaster. It's horrific. In New Zealand, our glaciers are also disappearing very, very fast. So we're rather conscious, I think, of the impact of climate change on coastal communities, on small island states. But the purpose of the editorial or op-ed in the Times was to draw attention to the plight of the mountain communities and the downstream communities of what's happening to our glaciers.
Just a really stark reminder of how urgent the action is. And again, for businesses to face into some of these really, really big, knotty, short-term challenges as much as planning for a future that's different for all of us. You clearly like trekking. You've got lots of things you do in your spare time, I know. But what sustains you? I think I know the answer because you've talked about networks and family. But what sustains you outside of work?
Well, I love trekking. This is a year for adventures, not only Nepal, but I have a voyage coming up to South Georgia in the South Atlantic where we go in the footsteps of Shackleton, who sailed the small boat from the maroon boat on the ice shelf to South Georgia and trekked over the mountains to a whaling station to get help for the men left behind on the stranded vessel. So that's going to be a big adventure as well.
But sorry, are you going to follow those footsteps?
I don't think we're going to climb the mountain range,
No.
but we will. We have a boat that will go around the islands and visit key points. But no doubt there'll be some trekking involved. I'm also patron of the Antarctic Heritage Trust, which looks after the heritage huts in a number of parts of Antarctica. So what keeps me going is, firstly, you need to keep physically fit and active so you can do these things, and also to carry out the life you want to lead, which involves a lot of travel and a lot of very late nights on Zoom from New Zealand and keeping on top of a lot of issues. So physical fitness, sense of well-being is pretty important.
If you could go back in time to the younger Helen Clark, what advice would you give yourself?
I would give myself the advice to be more confident in my own ability, perhaps at an earlier stage, because when I went into politics in New Zealand, there were so few women, and you never had it in your mind that you could be Prime Minister. You thought maybe one day you could be a minister, but you never had the sense of self-belief that you could go all the way, and that only came over time as you started to realise that each door needed to be walked through. So I hope that today young women growing up can see people like me and others who've walked through all these doors and got to the top, and they can do it, and they can probably do it at younger ages like Jacinda Ardern did, but believe in yourself from an early stage and never have any doubt that you can do these things.
Helen, thank you so much. There is so much you could take away from this. One, on a personal level, whether it's how you define yourself, which I think is a question that everybody should ask themselves. How do we define ourselves? It's also about the networks and not forgetting the importance of those networks that ground you as much as they support you and challenge you. I think the other thing that I really did take away from you is that let's not forget those searing experiences that each of us have. There will be something, and actually probably that is the root of the motivation. But on a business level, I mean, it's incredible. You talk about innovation, you talk about being prepared for risks. And as organizations, we're constantly reviewing the risk landscape, the risk surfaces. But you're right, how many organizations were really looking around that corner and actually looking at all risks equally, albeit we know the probability may be different. So that's a really interesting takeaway for me. And the final one is that professionalism, maintaining that no matter which stakeholder group you're interacting with, which is a really, really important thing. It is really clear to me why you're a notable feature in the Forbes most powerful women's list. Everything you do for sustainable development, for social equality, for climate change, and most importantly, for international cooperation, because we know we need that for some of the biggest challenges that we're facing into, climate being the that you've just talked about, biodiversity. And by that, international cooperation, can we as business also lean into that as well? The most important takeaway for me, Helen, is the importance of purpose and ethical purpose and ethical behaviours which underpin everything we're trying to do. Thank you very much, Helen. It's been an absolute privilege to have you.
Thank you.